Welcome to Central Coast Voices, a program addressing the ramifications of change in our communities and beyond, and how today's choices will impact tomorrow's community. This program is a combined project of KCBX and our rotating team of program hosts. Today on Central Coast Voices, your host Fred Munroe and his guest, Cal Poly Professor of Political Science, Dr. Michael Latner, will help us to better understand the 14th Amendment, the Voting Rights Act, and equality justice under law. The more we understand, the safer our democracy will remain. We do invite you to listen, learn, and participate in the conversation. We're live today, so we're able to take your calls at 805-781-3875. And with that, let's join Fred Munroe and his guest. Over to you, Fred.
Thank you, Brad. Good afternoon, folks. Welcome to Central Coast Voices. I'm your host, Fred Munroe. Our goal is to bring you credible and valid information and insights from diverse members of our community. Central Coast Voices addresses how today's choices will affect tomorrow's community. While Central Coast Voices really endeavors to keep things as local as possible and get a better understanding of things, sometimes the line between local issues and national issues becomes a little bit blurred enough that we can really go beyond our scope of just what's happening in our backyard. And today's topic is one of those. However, the good news is we get to bring in what I classify as one of my favorite local scholars to work with us on this topic. Michael Latner, who's a professor of political science at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, and he's currently also the director of research on democratic reform at the Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School. He's joining us today by phone. I appreciate the fact he's in Cambridge. I'm at Harvard right now, but I did not want to miss the opportunity to do a program with him, so he's here to talk to us today. A lot of things have gone on, and some of them affect us locally. Some of them are only national topics that we sit and scratch our heads about. The Voting Rights Act has been part of the discussion, probably more so than it has been in many, many years over the last 6 months or so, as congressional districting and gerrymandering becomes part of the discussion. Michael, we ask you to be here today because it's getting to the point where a good portion of what's going on as far as national politics and local politics, because all politics is really local, is hard for us to understand. And when I can't understand it, I call you.
Well, I'm sorry you aren't in a better position than that.
Why don't we start with, I think probably the most critical factor right now is what's been done with regard to what is called gerrymandering, even though for some people it's just referred to as redistricting, that has gone on over the last year, that some people think is just legal redistricting and other people think it is partisan pandering or manipulation. How do we look at that?
Yeah, so we are in the midst of what can only be considered a gerrymandering arms race. And what I mean by that is that typically at the end of or the beginning of every decade, we have the decennial census, and the purpose of the census, which is the largest scientific project that the government undertakes, is to count everyone and then to use those counts to allocate seats to the U.S. House of Representatives, and it's used to redistrict everything from local school boards to state legislatures up to Congress. What we're seeing now, which was initiated by the Trump administration with regard to seats in Texas, is really the culmination of a number of factors that were made possible by the Supreme Court. So in 2018, the Supreme Court decided in a case called Rucho v. Common Cause, which was a partisan gerrymandering case out of North Carolina, that there were no standards that the Supreme Court or that courts in general could use to determine how much gerrymandering is too much. That is, how much partisan advantage, a governing party in a given state is going to seek some sort of advantage. That's really the assumption going into this question, is that, well, of course, parties are going to try to seek advantage when they redistrict, and that's just politics. And so the question is there a level of partisan advantage seeking that violates, goes so far as to violate the Equal Protection Clause, equal treatment under the law, in the 14th Amendment. And so that case was decided. The Supreme Court said, no, we just have to throw our hands in the air. A divided Supreme Court made that decision. And that really opened the floodgates to pursue racial gerrymandering in a way and to call it partisan gerrymandering. And so in the case of Texas, for example, under the direction, actually under the threat of litigation from the Trump Department of Justice, the Texas state legislature was told that they need to redraw their congressional map and draw 5 new Republican seats. And in so doing, they're moving around the boundaries in such a way as to make some districts far more Democratic, that is, packing Democratic voters who are largely of Black and Hispanic descent into less competitive districts, and then to create districts that that lean more Republican, but are still competitive, but with a comfortable enough lead so that Republicans can win those seats. And so that really set off the gerrymandering arms race that we're seeing today. California responded with Proposition 50, and we have seen, a number of other states. Florida, I think, as of today or yesterday, just adopted a new map. Tennessee got rid of its only Black congressional district. Alabama reduced their districts from 2 to 1 majority Black districts. And so the consequences aren't just between parties, right? The consequences are really reaching into political equality itself. And what was a 70-year regime of voting rights in the United States, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, was passed to eliminate, not just to curtail, but to eliminate racial gerrymandering. And the case out of Louisiana, Calais, is now what we're seeing the consequences of this year, where now there's, because the court has decided that the tests used to identify and remedy racial gerrymandering are no longer applicable. And so the Voting Rights Act, arguably the most important piece of democracy legislation ever passed by Congress, is now dead. And so without the further guardrails that the Voting Rights Act provided, now there basically are no guardrails. And so we're seeing this massive change and attempt to gerrymander districts prior to the 2026 election.
Well, the two things that come to mind first is the Republican Party has seemed to imply that, well, if the Democrats are unhappy with what we've done, why did they go ahead and do it in California and consider it legal? And some people look at it as retaliatory activity. Other people look at it, well, we're just doing the same legal thing we did in Texas. If you outlaw a certain firearm, and your neighbors say, well, in order to protect myself from your outlawed firearm, I need to have an outlawed firearm. At some point, that discussion becomes difficult to have when you're pointing them at each other.
Well, and that's exactly, it's actually a very good analogy, because a world with no guns means that nobody dies of gunshot wounds, right? And so if you were to prohibit gerrymandering, then states just wouldn't engage in this kind of activity. But California's action, I think, are rightly understood as absolutely retaliatory, right? I mean, there's no question about it that Texas changed their 5 districts. California changed. I mean, it was literally tit for tat, right? And we're seeing this sweep across the United States, and I think there's no other way to interpret it other than both parties are now in an arms race, and ultimately the losers of all of this are the American people, because if you are a Republican in California or a Democrat in Texas, and if you're a voter of color in either state, frankly, because the parties are now putting their own interests ahead of the interest of voters, individual voters, and especially voters who are no longer protected under the Voting Rights Act. We're all losing in this arms race, and this is bad for democracy, and it's bad for all voters.
Yeah. Let me remind folks, we are taking calls today if you'd like to join the conversation and you have some questions for Michael. The opportunity to have a conversation with Michael Latner is always rewarding. The phone number is 805-781-3875. That's 781-3875. If you would prefer not to be part of the conversation, but you have a question or a concern you'd like to share with my guest and be part of the conversation, Brad, who's in the studio engineering, will take your information and pass it along during the discussion. You also can send notes after the program to voices@kcbx.org if you'd like information passed along to Michael. I can tell you my conversations over the years with Michael Latner have always been rewarding and understanding. Even though sometimes the information he shares with me is very frustrating, I remind him that he's the messenger and not the originator. So that's always helpful. This is probably a good opportunity. We haven't talked about it very much before. Your work for democratic reform with the Houston Institute, as you've talked to your colleagues there over the last 3 or 4 months, were most of them prepared for the stand that the Supreme Court has taken on these various issues, or were a lot of them surprised with how that went to? As a layman in this process, I'm flabbergasted at some of the things that the Supreme Court basically ruled upon this year.
Yeah, so my colleagues at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute and myself were absolutely aware, and I say that not boastfully, but regrettably. The reason that I came to Harvard Law from Cal Poly to work at the Institute was because we've seen this coming. Really, the dismantling of the Voting Rights Act began in 2013 with the decision Shelby v. Holder, which outlawed Section 5, which was the preclearance standard that served as a guardrail against pernicious electoral laws, discriminatory electoral laws for nearly 50 years. The cases that have followed, so Brnovich and a series of other court cases, and ending in this case regarding Louisiana's congressional districts, Calais, have really built on what is the court's ideology and I would say a reinterpretation of the 14th Amendment and how it applies to race, the 14th and 15th Amendments. And so we should take a little bit of time to talk about what the court's vision is and how they broke the consensus on prohibitions against racial discrimination. So, I want to give the court, this is going to be somewhat controversial, but there's a normative element in what the court is seeing, right? And they see the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, equal treatment under the law. They see the 15th Amendment's prohibition against abridging the vote by race, right? And so they're looking for a racially blind society. And I think that's actually a normative goal that many of us can agree on. The question, of course, and where I think the court has gone wrong from just a practical U.S. political perspective is that you cannot simply reinterpret the Constitution to say, well, we're just going to ignore race and we're going to say that the Constitution is blind to race because we want to live in a racially blind society. Do you see what I'm getting at there? Because we don't live in a racially blind society, and we can we can say, certainly. We can just
we'd like to live in a racially blind society, but the road to get there is full of ruts.
Well, indeed, and there is. So, I think one element of the court's decision that the status quo, I think that there's a lot of folks that would agree that the status quo was increasingly difficult to implement. Yeah. And what I mean by that is carving voters out into single-seat districts so that you have majority-minority districts. So you're creating districts such that a group that is would otherwise be unable to receive representation because the majority of voters consistently vote against their candidates and against their interests, right? Those are the conditions under which the VRA was created, and it's still the conditions under which many voters live today. Yeah. Right?
So hold on a minute. We have a caller who has a Green Party question, so hold on a minute.
Okay.
Donna, you're on the air. Thanks for your patience.
Well, thank you. So I'm concerned primarily about third parties and how gerrymandering is not the answer to getting third party fair representation in elections. We're seeing a rise of people who are interested in third parties, but gerrymandering is not the answer. Really, proportional representation is the answer as far as the Green Party is concerned and any other third party. Proportional representation, so we have a representative selected by the number of people registered in that party, and then also ranked choice voting would come into play as a way of equalizing the election process. So I'd like to hear the comments that you have about that. Thank you.
Yeah, Donna, that's a good question. If you're not familiar with Michael Latner's, he shares some of the most interesting views on ranked voting that I've ever heard. And he'll understand.
Yeah,
so please answer.
So it's a great question. I would say up front, though, ranking ballots doesn't really get you anything, and I wouldn't confuse ranked choice voting with proportional representation.
Exactly.
But proportional representation, right, having more than one representative elected per district, it is actually a way out of this. And so I want to put a flag in that because I do want to talk about solutions. And you're absolutely right that the whole gerrymandering arms race is a two-party game, right? Because when you are carving populations, whether it's for partisan gain or for racial dominance, the only way that game makes sense is when you have single-seat districts to draw. And so as soon as you move to a system where you're electing 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 candidates per district and you're using a proportional allocation formula, that is you're giving seats to parties in terms of their share of votes, and you don't need a majority of votes to win a seat, right, then it literally kills the incentive to gerrymander. So the U.S. is the only country that has these sorts of gerrymandering arms races because we are the only two-party system in the world.
Will we ever see in the United States a multi-party system that really works?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think, it's only 4:20, but if you want to start talking about solutions, I'm game. I think it is actually, it's not a pipe dream. It is not a radical sort of reform to think about what does PR in the U.S. look like? Well, it's a way out of this gerrymandering arms race, for one thing, and it also is a concrete, practical solution to the question of how do we move forward now that the Voting Rights Act is dead.
Yeah,
and that's something that we should be working on. Yeah. Congress should be working on it. The state of California should be working on it, and the solution is pretty straightforward. You just need multi-seat districts, so at least 3 seats per district. And so for Congress, for example, for California, that would include 16, you could do 16 3-seat districts and one 4-seat district. And so you'd have a little Central Coast district, with maybe Carvajal and Pineda and I don't know whoever's in Ventura or some adjacent district. I mean, they wouldn't be that big of a district. And what you do by opening up that competition is not only, to the caller's point, do you open up competition for more than two parties, but even if the two parties are still going to be the dominant forces in U.S. politics, what you do is you disincentivize gerrymandering, because no matter how you carve 3 or 5 or 7-seat districts, multiple parties are going to win, right? And so that it actually takes the barb and it takes the reward away from gerrymandering, and it is, in my view, one of the only ways we get out of this. I don't think that you get out of the gerrymandering arms race by just having more strict districting requirements, for example.
Donna, thank you for the call.
Yep. Thank you.
We'll keep listening. Thank you for the call. Michael, one side question that may not have come up with the conversation about multi-seat districts. I'm assuming that you're talking about a system that basically enlarges the district, so we're not enlarging the size of Congress.
Yeah, there's several ways to go about it, but the simplest system would be what I would call a simple flex list or an ordered list system. So let's say you have your 5-seat districts. So you're not increasing the size of the assembly or the legislature. You're just increasing the geographic size of the district so that more seats are elected by district. And then you have what is just a simple list system. So any group of candidates that wants to run together, so the Democrats use, for example, whatever process they currently use for primaries, and that just becomes the general list of candidates, right? Republicans do the same thing, and then you just have an election for those 5 seats. Really nothing changes from the voters' perspective. So voters just pick their favorite candidate, right, just like they do now. Or, and this is where, you get some change, is voters also have the option of just choosing the group or the party. So if they want to just vote Democrat or just vote Republican or just vote working families or, the business council or whatever group of candidates they support, they can just support the group. And however voters vote, seats are allocated to groups by the list, right? They're not it's not just about how individual candidates do, it's about how the coalition does. And that's what makes it a proportional outcome, right? So if Republicans get 30% of the votes, they get 30% of the seats, which is a lot better than they're doing under the current system in California now. And by creating a proportional outcome, you're encouraging competition. There are no more safe seats. And crucially, from my perspective, every vote counts the same. And parties have an incentive to go after every vote, because there are no safely Republican or safely Democratic seats anymore. And when you open up competition like that, you increase participation, you increase turnout, and as I argued earlier, it's just not worth it to try to gerrymander multi-seat districts because the payoff isn't there.
So what we're really doing is making it making it too complex for the average politician to sort out, so they'll leave it alone.
Well, I mean, yeah. When I hear critics of these sorts of proposals say, "Well, that's too big of a change. That's too complicated or too complex." It's actually a much less complex system than we have now, right? Now we have a system where you've got to use a ton of procedural requirements. We have an independent redistricting commission, and it's got to look at a million maps, and every community's fighting for their chunk of the pie in this zero-sum game. And then you create a bunch of single-seat districts, and then you go through a decade of litigation, basically, because every time you get a new map, you get a new lawsuit. We could do away with much of that by adopting a simple list system.
Yeah. Let me remind folks, we're talking with Michael Latner, professor of political science at Cal Poly, and he's also the director of research and development and democratic reform at the Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School. He's joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts today because he's spending a lot of time at the Harvard Law School, and he'll be. I'll warn some students. I believe, Michael, you'll be back next fall at Cal Poly, so people should be prepared for your return.
Yes, for better or worse, I'm coming back to teach.
Yeah. Anyway, you can still give us a call, 805-781-3875. Call in, and if you would have a question or an observation that you'd like to share but you don't want to be on the air, Brad will take your information in the studio, and you can share it with us. Michael, we've got a couple of minutes, and we won't be able to probably get through the full discussion, but I am stuck on the concept of whether or not there is any way the Voting Rights Act is recoverable with a different Supreme Court or a different process, because all of the scholars, including you, pretty much have made the comment that it's pretty close to dead, and we're not into resuscitation.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a handful of legal scholars, and I'm not a lawyer and should not be mistaken for one, but there are a handful of legal scholars who argue, as the Supreme Court does, mind you, right? I mean, the Supreme Court in their Calais decision has said, look, the VRA is just fine. We have just tweaked the solution part of Section 2 so that it complies with, and I'll use big air quotes, our view of the Constitution, right? And so there certainly are, and if you listen to the Supreme Court, they will tell you, or if you read the opinion, they'll say the Voting Rights Act is still alive and well. It's just that you can't just design a set of districts. So if you identify that there's racial vote dilution happening, right? You do an analysis of how votes convert into seats, and you say, look, we can identify racial vote dilution here. That is, members of a protected class, let's say black voters, their votes are not converting in, their candidates are being beat on a regular basis by a white majority who, if we were to draw districts differently, we could do away with this discriminatory effect, right? And so what the Supreme Court has said is fine, but you have to distinguish between partisan effect and racial effect. That is, are the people whose votes are being undercounted, is that because they're black, or is it because they're voting for Democrats? And if they're voting for Democrats, well, hey, that's just partisanship, right? And so, and of course, the statistical, as someone who teaches statistics at Cal Poly, this is an elementary mistake that none of my students would make. That is the correlation between being a black voter and voting Democratic, especially in a state like Louisiana, where you have very high levels of racial polarization in voting. There is no way to demonstrate that there is something other than party that's happening there. That is, black voters vote for Democrats, white voters vote for Republicans, and there's no way to distinguish. And indeed, one could go so far as to kind of play this logic out, right? That if all we're doing is looking at party and we're ignoring race, well, we could just have a whole conversation about the Civil War in partisan terms, right? So, for example, in the state of Louisiana, we might recall that there was an insurrection, and in that insurrection occurred in, let's see, what year was that? That was in.
Michael, I'm going to put you on hold for a second because we've got to take our break. You can look on that during the break. And,
okay, I've got it.
And Bill, we do have your call. You'll be on right after the break, but it's about the time to take our bottom of the hour break. People can catch their breath a little bit. Michael will come back to the question in a moment. This is Central Coast Voices. My guest today is Michael Latner, and one of my foremost authorities on constitutional law and politics, and I'm glad he's joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts today. And we'll be back in just a moment. This is Central Coast Voices.
I'm Maria Hinojosa. This week on Latino USA, it's been 10 years since a mass shooting at the gay nightclub Pulse in Orlando, Florida. We speak with a survivor.
Sometimes when I close my eyes, I see when I was on the floor.
And look at what's changed for LGBTQ plus people since then. That's this week on Latino USA.
On the next Fresh Air, comic Josh Johnson, one of the anchors of The Daily Show.
Let's start with the most urgent issue facing America today. Donald Trump still doesn't have a ballroom, all right?
Johnson gets millions of views on his YouTube comedy channel, where he posts his comedy club performances, and he has a new HBO comedy special. Join us.
There are a lot of things in the economic world right now that are changing, like the tax code.
We can't solve our problems with a tax cut. We need to solve it with a tax reform.
It has to be a win-win-win-win-win, and that is very hard to achieve with tax policy.
This happens once in a generation.
I'm Kai Risdall. We'll guide you through it next time on Marketplace.
That's a look ahead on our Thursday here on KCBX with Fresh Air coming up from 3 to 4. Latino USA follows this program from 2 till 3. Then it's Fresh Air from 3 to 4. And then Marketplace from 4 to 4:30. Right now, let's return to Fred Munroe and a lively discussion with his guest on Central Coast Voices. Over to you, Fred.
Thank you, Brad. We're back with Michael Latner, professor of political science at Cal Poly, and we've gone over his other credentials too. But I can share with you that he is very involved in research and constitutional law. And I'm sorry, my note in front of me that actually has the name of the organization is buried in the pages here. Sorry about that. Director of Research on Democratic Reform at the Houston Institute for Race and Justice at Harvard Law School. That has got to be an incredibly challenging position and very rewarding to be part of. And Michael will talk about that a little bit in a moment. I want to give Bill a call, our caller here. Hold on a second. Bill, thanks for your patience. You have some observations about media's role in freezing out third parties.
Ask him how.
He gets to hear you, so you can ask him.
Yeah, ask him how are you going to prevent the duopoly and the media from freezing out third-party candidates if that's a solution to redistricting?
Well, that's a great question, Bill. So certainly, I don't think there's any getting away from the fact that the major parties the Democratic and Republican parties are going to be the major parties in the United States, regardless of what reform gets implemented. At the same time, there is encouraging news when you look at public opinion polls. People hate the major parties. 3/4 or more of Americans say that there ought to be more than two parties. And certainly when you look at voter registration rolls, whether it's in California or New Hampshire or in the South or in the North, the number of voters who are increasingly registered with third parties or as independents or no party preference is increasing and has been increasing for quite some time. So I think that there's plenty of public support for the emergence of minor parties. But you're absolutely right that to the extent that resources matter, I mean, we're going to have, the two major parties are going to continue to dominate U.S. politics, which is actually not as bad as it sounds as long as there is legitimate competition. And I think that's really the
how do you prod the media into calling attention to the candidates, including KCBX? I never heard Jill Stein's name mentioned once in any of the major news media, including KCBX.
So I think part of that has to do with the fact that third parties can't effectively compete right now. But once you do change the rules and you open up competition, the media will follow, when parties are making a difference. And so the reaction of the major parties to minor parties, that will become news in and of itself. So I'm confident that the media will follow the noise wherever it is.
I hope you're right.
Yeah.
Okay,
Bill,
thanks.
I would agree with you too. I hope you're right.
Okay.
All right. Thanks for the call.
Sure.
Why I'm interested to know why we did not see more potential for third parties in the governor's primary that came up. I mean that was a situation where I suppose someone could have moved into a more strategic position based upon how incredibly wide open that was.
Yeah, it's a good point. Unfortunately, the top two system, I don't think is amenable to minor parties. It's certainly not amenable to minor parties at the legislative level. But with regard to the governor's race, it was such a free for all, and one could argue that we do have a system that allows outside candidates to come in. I mean, Arnold Schwarzenegger was certainly one of those type of candidates when we had the recall of Governor Gray Davis. I believe I ended up voting for a sumo wrestler in that election, but there were a lot of options, right? But the thing is you can't look to executive office for the emergence of third parties. Parties have to be built from the ground up. And so you've got to have rules in place that allow for real competition between coalitions. You call them parties or call them slates or alliances, whatever you want to call them. You've got to have that capacity for competition at the legislative level, because that's where parties do their work. And you've got to let parties party, right? They need to be able to organize, coalesce. You need movements to be able to energize voters and have that energy converted into power. And you do that through legislative seats.
Yeah. Okay. Side question that's kind of I would put in the category of stupid Supreme Court questions coming from the host here. Does the Supreme Court have the right under its own prerogative to revisit a decision, or does it have to come only from a case of a wronged party? In other words, if the Supreme Court shifts over the next 6 or 8 years, can the Supreme Court revisit their stand on the Voting Rights Act and say, we want to reconsider this?
Oh, absolutely. In principle, right? I mean, that's what...
Has it ever happened?
Well, sure. You had Griswold v. Connecticut. You've had the Supreme Court overturn itself on numerous occasions, probably, most saliently with Brown v. Board of Education, right? Yeah. Overturning the separate but equal doctrine that the Supreme Court itself set, right? And so you certainly do have those moments, and it does happen, but are you willing to wait for 40, 50, 60 years?
It's just a dream.
Yeah, and certainly there are a number of folks in the reform space advocating for court reform as well, right? Reformulating the structure of the Supreme Court, adding term limits or
adding seats,
changing the selection procedures, some of which I think would be grand ideas, but that's, a different part of the reform process.
Is the state of California in Prop 50 followed and responded to the Republicans in Texas and other locations? Mm-hmm. Does that become something that gets automatically undone in 2030 when we get to the 10-year mark for redistricting, or what happens now?
Yeah, so as I understand it, the way that the statute for Prop 50 is written is that it does reset in the next census. So 2030 would be the next redistricting. So the maps that are in place now will stay in place through 2030, and then we start the process all over. what does that look like in 2030? Well, I think it depends a lot on what national politics looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And as I have suggested to your listeners early on, I'm not at all confident that we're just going to, legislate our way out of this with some incremental reforms. I think Congress has to take action, I think most people are looking at this from the perspective of a Democratic trifecta. So if Democrats take control of the Senate, the House, and the presidency in 2028, they could initiate a big structural reform, a set of legislation. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to look at the state legislatures. I think there's more opportunity for bipartisan support in the state legislatures. But even in Congress, I would strongly encourage folks to be talking to folks on both sides of the aisle, because you do want something that is going to be defended. To the extent that you get just a partisan reform, it's going to be vulnerable to the next wave of change that changes which party controls Congress. So you really need to build a robust bipartisan structural reform, and that means something that both parties are willing to buy into that's better than the status quo. And I think you've actually got a lot more Republicans in California, for example, that could get on board with a simple structural reform that would guarantee free and fair competition. So that, at the end of the day, that's the best you can ask for.
Yeah. It's showing up on a number of different media outlets that there's a certain segment of the Republican population and Republican legislators in California who are, how do I word this, seem to be somewhat embarrassed by having another discussion about voter fraud. And I'm wondering if the Trump administration realizes they may be eroding their own supporters as part of this process, and whether or not that's going to affect anything before 28. It's certainly not going to probably affect anything in 26.
Well, unfortunately, my reading of the attacks on California are sort of test messaging for the November 2026 election. It's very unfortunate, but I see that that's what's happening, and I'm not alone in that. We're likely to see a huge amount of allegations of election fraud and attempts to not certify ballots, and after that, possibly attempts to not seat members of Congress. And that's a real dark place to go, but I think that's where we're headed.
I usually trust your judgment, and I'm sorry to hear that, but it doesn't surprise me.
But there is a way out, right? I mean, the good news is that, it's going to get a little uglier before it gets better, but there are ways out. And, on the subject of California, it is, I think it should be frustrating to every Californian that we just don't provide the resources we need to count ballots efficiently and fast. There really is no excuse. Yes, it's a ton of ballots, but all we need are people counting them. The rest of the world does it. The rest of, it's not simply, a matter of, well, per capita, we've got more mail ballots. We don't actually. Oregon, Washington, Utah, there are a number of states where the percent of ballots that come in are higher with regard to mail ballots. So it's really just not an excuse, and we need to be focusing on getting a more efficient system for certifying the elections in California, because the longer you go from election day to certification, the more time you're giving bad actors to cast doubt on the results.
Yeah. Do we have a different system in California of signature verification? Because in my thoughts, the slowest part of the process is signature verification. You can run the ballots through the machine in about 5 nanoseconds.
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right. It is the signature verification process and the double checking and triple checking, and that's good, right? I mean, we want to validate every ballot, and we want to give people who have maybe have not had their ballots counted because there's a problem, we want to give them time to cure their ballots. But there's got to be a limit, and there's got to be, I mean, it really does boil down to we just need more people processing ballots. We need more machines. We need more people so that we're cutting down the time that it takes to certify the election.
Yeah. I'll make this personal in a maybe a strange way. I used to vote by mail-in ballot because it was convenient for me to have it done and out of the way. I actually stopped voting by mail-in ballot a number of years ago because I developed a hand tremor in my dominant hand, and I'm thoroughly convinced that my signature never looks the same twice, and I don't want to find out way after the fact that my vote didn't get counted. I'm wondering if there's any verification process other than signature that's ever been considered.
Yeah, there is actually, and there's a whole science on election forensics that deals with these sorts of issues. Michael Herndon, actually, who's lives with us in San Luis Obispo, he is an expert on signature verification, and he's from the UCLA School of Political Science down there, and they're doing great work on looking to improve signature verification processes and not leave it to administrator discretion. What ends up is you get a lot of human error. And so there are processes and there are ways that we're getting much better at it, but we're just still far too slow.
My thought is we may be not just dealing with human error, we're dealing with human concern with potential errors. No one wants to be the signature checker that gets called out on a disproportionate number of signature errors. So everybody may be overly cautious.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Fred. Let me clarify. By error, I do not mean voter error. Most of the errors that happen, and by far the vast majority of ballots that are rejected in California and rejected for ballot signature reason, and there are tens and tens of thousands of them. I mean, it's really insane the number of ballots we reject. Most of those are eligible voters, and those are eligible votes. But it is administrative error that is the cause of for having them rejected. And we know this because we've done the back studies.
Is there statistics available to the general public or through you about how many ballots are rejected for fraudulent signatures that are really bona fide rejected ballots?
Yeah, they don't call them fraudulent signatures. There's a signature mismatch. And yeah, that is publicly available information, and there are a couple of studies that have analyzed, gone back to look at who's casting signatures that are likely to be rejected. And so we know that the vast majority of those rejections are actually eligible voters having their votes rejected.
Does any of this feel promising?
Oh, yeah. I'm an optimist for two reasons, Fred. One, things can always get worse.
I'm sorry. That is the worst explanation for why you're an optimist I've ever heard, Michael.
But second, we actually have the tools to improve the process, and it's not rocket science. It's just political science, and we know how to design electoral systems in ways that are robust and resilient and competitive. We actually know quite a bit. We have over 100 years of really good comparative election data across the world's democracies, and so we have a pretty good idea of what works. It's just a question as to whether we have the political will to implement some of these reforms.
What do you see getting resolved in this 26 election that will maybe slow? I mean, regardless of what you may think the outcome may be, I'm wondering if we are going to look at a different view on how to proceed after the 26 election, or we're just stuck in the same cycle until 28.
Well, that's a great question, and it's there's a couple of things, right? I mean, if it's really the sort of blue wave that we're looking at with the special elections and with the generic congressional ballot polling data and the president's unpopularity and inflation's rising, right? I mean, there are a lot of elements colluding to make this what would normally be a historically good year for the Democratic Party, which means that even if there are some shenanigans going on and, Republicans have gerrymandered themselves a 4, 5, 6 seat advantage, a big wave election will overcome all that. And it just won't matter because Democrats will win 25, 30, 35 seats. But, things are so uncertain and so chaotic right now that it's unclear. So, I hope for, as all the election administrators say, we always want high turnout and wide margins, right? So there's no uncertainty in the outcome. But even then, right, let's say that we have a clear outcome. It's still not clear that we are building the coalition that we need to make the changes that we need. And in fact, one of my greatest fears is that the Democratic Party acts like they're not actually playing poker, because in poker, you can't beat something with nothing. But often the Democratic Party thinks, well, as long as they hate the other guys more, we'll be fine. And I think that would be a stupid and historically disastrous mistake for them to make.
You would think that they would have learned that from the last general election.
You'd think, but we'll see.
Michael, this is always a good discussion. I am still somewhat bewildered, and I'll leave you with this. We have a couple of minutes for another ridiculous question from the host. The latest decisions by the Supreme Court, for a lot of us, they were surprising. For those of you who are scholars, were they all expected?
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, I'm not actually a judicial scholar. You'd have to talk to Nancy Bayes-Arrington at Cal Poly to talk about judicial politics. But the short answer is no. That this ideological shift that is going on the court has been happening for quite some time, and so it is in that sense quite predictable. The court has changed composition, not just in terms of its political, its partisan, its ideology, but the composition of the court has changed dramatically in terms of who actually sits on the court, right? I mean, we have, as in much of society, we have a much more elite-driven court, right? I mean, people that are scholars, that are not politicians. I think the last sitting politician on the court was Sandra Day O'Connor, who had actually run for office. Yeah. I mean, these are people who live in the world of legal philosophy, and they may not try cases. And I think that has a profound effect on the way that the court sees the American people or fails to see them. Okay. Because I actually have a tremendous amount of faith in the American people. We are divided, deeply divided in many ways in terms of how we're treated by the political parties. But, I know from my own experience that I can sit down with my group of friends who we have a lot of political disagreements, but we can figure out pretty straightforward, common sense solutions to most of our problems given enough time and enough whiskey.
And maybe it just means more conversations and less pontification.
Indeed.
We'll kind of leave it with that for the moment. As most of my listeners know, I make sure that my guests get the last word and a perspective, hopefully beyond what I've asked. So, Michael, what do you want to make sure people take away from this conversation and maybe take with them to the November election? Gosh,
I guess I would say hang in there. It's going to get worse. But on the other side of that,
can you restart that, please, with a little more optimistic talk?
It's going to get worse, but it will also get better. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that the history of this country is largely the history of overcoming obstacles and barriers. And we have become a better country, a better democracy, because we stand on the shoulders of giants who've come before us. Every generation has to fight to expand freedom, to expand our capacity to rule ourselves, and it's no different for us. This is a part of a cycle in American history, and so we shouldn't be surprised that we're here. We need to get our shoulders against the stone, and we need to make this happen, and I'm confident that we will.
I'm always encouraged by your comments because I tend to be somewhat skeptical, but I'm trying to make sure that I outlive this particular dilemma that we're in right now.
well, let me agree with you that I hope you outlive this as well.
Great.
I hope that we can. I hope I see you on the other side.
Yep. All righty. This has been Central Coast Voices. My guest today is Michael Latner, a wonderful scholar both in constitutional law and in political science from Cal Poly and from Harvard University right now. He's joining us. I'll warn some of the incoming students at Cal Poly or some of the students returning next fall that Michael will be back at Cal Poly, and be prepared because he doesn't accept answers that are not complete and distinct in his classes. Chris Kington Barker will be with you next week. I'll be back with you in about a month. We are, of course, in rotation with all of our hosts. I'm not quite sure what Chris's program is next week, but she'll always have a lively program. Central Coast Voices is a production of KCBX Public Radio, and we are always delighted to be doing part of this program with KCBX as our host to the program. You can reach us at voices@kcbx.org with comments, questions, or information you'd like passed on to our guests. My guest today has been Michael Latner. It's been a pleasure having you all with us. Thank you to listener-supported public radio. Thank you to Brad Kyle, our in-studio engineer. This has been Central Coast Voices.